this phenomenon of violent extremism. The ideology, the networks, the capacity to recruit young people. This has metastasized, and it is widespread, and it has penetrated communities around the world.
In what would have to go under the title, Things We Must Have Already Known and Seemingly Decided to Ignore, news reports indicate there are terror cells hiding in places such as Belgium, the United Kingdom, and right here in the United States. As if those with any common sense needed to be reminded. Are we truly keeping track of them, or are we only doing our best, which just might not be enough? Welcome to Midpoint. Former member of the U.S. Department of Justice Anti-Terror Advisory Committee under President George W. Bush, current John Templeton Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, Edward Turzanski joins us. Ed, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Ed.
Ed, let's get around to the numbers here, first of all. In a Washington Post ABC News poll, it asked people, how do you feel about the possibility of a major terrorist attack in the United States? A whopping 76% of the people said they're worried, 23% said they are not. I ask you then, is this, as some people would claim, merely people scared because of scare tactics from the media and others, or is this, in reality, maybe 76% is too low?
Ed, I think it's an indication that the American people have much more intuitive wisdom than some of the people who lead them. And the key is that, as you've said, we have prima facie evidence of terror cells in Europe. Keep in mind that the head of MI5, which is Britain's version of our FBI, has warned that terror cells are not only extant, that is to say they're in place, but they are operationally ready to act. And he did not confine the warning just to Paris. He was talking about Europe, England, Canada, the United States. We know for a fact that law enforcement and counterterror people have been keeping an eye on terror cells, and the president trying to say that this is just extremism is like the individual goes to the doctor, you know he's a raging alcoholic, and the doctor says, what are you doing wrong? And he says, well, I just make unhealthy lifestyle choices. And he doesn't drill down to the detail so that you can deal with his health problem. It's the same thing here. If you don't call things by their real name, you won't come up with the method in which to detect, prevent, and respond to the problem.
We were caught off guard in 9/11. That's obvious. The Europeans and many others caught off guard at certain times. With 76% of Americans being fearful of attack, Ed, what do we then hang our hat on as far as our intelligence agencies being ready for it? Because it seems as if every single time in the past we have been caught off guard, something's been missed, or else we simply have just waved it aside as if, don't worry about it. How can we trust that we're ready?
So, Ed, you bring up a very good point. 9/11 is the benchmark. And people say, well, the CIA and FBI did not play well with one another. They weren't connecting dots. But since then, we have had attacks, and I'll mention one in particular, Nidal Hassan at Fort Hood, Texas. Mm-hmm. We did connect the dots. We found out that he was in communication with Anwar al-Awlaki. The problem is we didn't do anything about it.
Why?
Quite well, this is where we get into the mindset of the administration and the notion that anything points to a root having to do with Islamist terror is downplayed. And in the case of Nidal Hassan, the FBI said, well, he's seeking religious guidance. This would be an infringement of his rights. It's losing common sense because of political correct sensibilities about Islam that prevents our counterintelligence, intelligence, and law enforcement people from doing something when those dots are connected. We're making the connection. We're just not doing things because this administration won't let them happen.
I got about 30 seconds, then we'll take a break, come back and talk more. But in your opinion right now, FBI, CIA, NSA, do they feel as if they're walking around with handcuffs on 24/7?
Handcuffs and short pants. They are severely restricted in what they can do and say. They won't admit it publicly because no one's going to commit political hara-kiri and go against the administration. But when you talk to the people on the ground, They recognize that there are constraints to action, much as those border control agents reported in terms of dealing with our illegal problem, which is also connected in some fashion to what we see in terms of the terror threat.
And we'll talk about that more when we return right here on Midpoint. Let's welcome back to Midpoint a John Templeton Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, former member of the U.S. Department of Justice Anti-Terror Advisory Committee, Edward Turzanski. Ed, I've got here a quote from Sir Malcolm Rifkind, who is the chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee in the United Kingdom, where he talks about threats and terror cells. He says, if, as we all accept, the problem is international jihadi terrorism, how do international terrorists communicate with each other? They communicate by the internet, by email, by social messaging. That's the world we live in. He is basically pointing out that if any country is going to get down to the core of the terrorists, we must look at these communications. On the other side, you have people worried about their loss of civil liberties, saying you cannot go after us. It's simply not right. How do we then cut the difference there, get to where the terrorists are working, be able to ferret them out, and still maintain that thinking process, that law of civil liberties?
And all throughout the Cold War, the West was at a disadvantage because we had laws and public opinions to deal with, and the Soviets didn't. But it doesn't mean that we lost our mind and forgot the simple truth that if you're not alive, you won't be able to enjoy certain civil liberties. You won't be able to enjoy any of them, in fact. And too often, what we have done as a default position, and it's not just the Obama administration, the Bush administration was just as guilty. They put everyone under the same scrutiny to say that we're not being unfair to any particular group. Well, when we focus on those most likely to engage in terrorism, we look at a whole host of activities, a whole host of characteristics, if you will. Unfortunately, this label of profiling has denied to law enforcement and to most policymakers the common sense approach to say that if you've been to certain places, done certain things, and said certain things, you may actually be engaged in terror activity. We've got to get that. We've got to get past that. We've got to bring common sense back into the application of our laws and the methods we use to deal with the problem.
And do we need to tell the general public, the American people, that if you want to continue living the kind of life that you want, if you really want to live a free life here in America, if you want to be as safe as you can from terrorist attacks, you must realize that profiling is an absolute necessity if we have to do it, stop the political correctness. And the second thing is, you will have your emails, your internets, your phone calls listened to from time to time, but if you're not doing anything wrong, don't sweat it. We're only looking for the bad guys, and we're not trying to bag somebody who's innocent.
Yeah, and I'd add to that there are protections under the law to make sure that the situation is not abused, although I must tell you that the people who push back against this, some of them are of ill intent, but some of them are honest people who say, wait a minute, the IRS abused, under Lois Lerner and the Obama administration, the IRS went after people who exercise constitutional rights. This same metric of you didn't do anything wrong, you don't have to be worried about it. Well, there were abuses on the part of the government there, and they should be punished. That's why when an abuse takes place, it has to be dealt with harshly so that people have the confidence to know exactly what you said. If you're not engaged in any kind of terror activity, and we're just collecting metadata so that we can point to commonalities or establish patterns, you don't have anything to worry about unless you're engaged in something illegal.
I got about 90 seconds left here. We just saw some videotape of the EU, the foreign policy chief. The folks there were meeting in Brussels at a Muslim nations summit of EU foreign ministers, talk about some of the terrorist ideas that they have involved. They're talking about here at the Brussels talks. The threat is not only the one we faced in Paris, but is also spreading in many other parts of the world, starting from Muslim countries. Is that Fair to say that that's got to be the nexus, because the Muslim countries are not doing anything to stop the terrorists from going outside their borders. They even pay them. They even help them at this point. So if we're really going to deal with the problem, we got to get down to the core of the countries here who are basically fostering the terrorism.
Yes, and we need to do one more thing as we're making that hardwire connection and recognizing that it exists. Too many countries have grown comfortable with the accommodation of no-go zones for their police, and in effect have ceded over portions of their sovereign territory to Sharia law and to Muslim communities which refuse to participate in the rest of civil society and won't accept civil law. 750 no-go zones in France. You can make the case that the French have created the conditions so that the other side knows they can intimidate us. They can cower us into a reflexive position where we won't push back. If we're going to have equal protection under the law for everyone, there can't be no-go zones.
We're going to have to make that the final word, because you're right, it is all about intimidation as well. Edward Turzanski, thank you so much for joining us. We'll look forward to the next time.
Thanks, Ed.
All right, break, and we're back with the tale of robbing